The Confederate flag is a symbol that I was extremely familiar with while I was growing up. It became common for me to see it around my family. My uncle has a tattoo of the Confederate flag on his left arm. My cousin always sported her Confederate flag-themed bathing suit on family vacations to the beach. And my grandfather proudly hugged the flag in his garage until the day that he died. When I was younger, I was taught that the flag was associated with the concept of Southern pride. I saw no problem with this at the time. The phrase, "it's how I was raised," is something that I heard very often from my mother and her siblings. Whenever they said something shockingly racist or discriminatory, it all went back to, "it's how I was raised." Years later, now that I have grown to develop my own ideas, I am no longer comfortable when I hear, "it's how I was raised," in order to make excuses for racist remarks. I am no longer comfortable with racism being accepted in my family. I am no longer comfortable with coming to terms that I was raised in the exact same manner that my mother was. I was raised to hate. I felt as if I was the only one in my family that was uncomfortable being around racist people and racist ideas. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, I began following the movement and what was going on with the community. After Dylan Ruff killed 9 people in an African American church, my family became interested in what was going on. However, they were not interested in justice for the people who had been murdered. They were more worried about being able to purchase the Confederate flag at Walmart. According to my uncle, flying the Confederate flag was his God-given right, regardless of the stigma attached to it. My uncle was terrified that the liberals were going to take away his rights. This reaction from my Confederate flag-loving uncle reminded me of the Alabama judge from the pretrial case in Just Mercy. Bryan Stevenson, who was a black lawyer, presented a motion in order to include African Americans in the jury pool. At this time of the motion, African Americans were excluded from being on the jury in Alabama, even though the population of the community was nearly 30% black. Stevenson argued that this exclusion of African Americans was unconstitutional and that it was also an inaccurate representation of the population. The judge replied, "I'm going to grant your motion, Mr. Stevenson, but I'll be honest. I'm pretty fed up with people always talking about minority rights. African Americans, Mexican Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans. When is someone going to come in my courtroom and protect the rights of Confederate Americans?" This quote was taken from Chapter 10 in Just Mercy. This chapter is entitled Mitigation and focuses on the mental illnesses in the prison system, but also details the encounters of racism that Bryan Stevenson faced. As Bryan Stevenson made his way into a prison in order to meet with Avery Jenkins, a mentally disabled client, he notices a truck that looked like a shrine to the Old South. Stevenson describes the truck as having disturbing bumper stickers and decals with troubling images. After describing the truck, Stevenson says that despite growing up around images of the Confederate South, he was still pretty shaken by these symbols. While I was growing up, the Confederate flag did not bother me. It was a familiar symbol that I associated with my family roots. Like Bryan Stevenson, although I grew up with a plethora of Confederate symbolism around me, after becoming aware of the stigma that's attached to the Confederate flag and the fear that it instills in people, I immediately become uncomfortable whenever I see the Confederate flag. In my old high school, there were a few boys who decided to fly the Confederate flag from their trucks in order to take a stance against those who were trying to ban the Confederate flag. Coming from a southern area, the people were under the impression that their heritage was being stripped by the efforts to ban the Confederate flag. The white boys were more concerned about preserving their so-called heritage instead of making their fellow students comfortable and feeling safe. The most disturbing part about this situation is that the administration at the high school did nothing to stop the boys and saw no problem with what was going on. In high school, I was a member of the Student Government Association. At one of our meetings, I brought up the Confederate flags that were proudly flying in the student parking lot. I asked my advisor if this was allowed. She said that it makes pretty much everyone uncomfortable in the school. However, there is no rule that explicitly bans them from doing what they're doing. It is my dream that my family grows out of ignorance and away from learned hate. The story of the guard gives me hope for my family. The guard who harassed Bryan Stevenson attended the Avery Jenkins hearing. After the guard listened to what Avery Jenkins was going through and how he came to be in the position that he is in, the guard developed a sense of empathy. The guard realized he had things in common with Jenkins despite their completely different lives. The foster care system had failed them both. I hope my family develops a sense of empathy through education like the guard did and like I have. With this newfound understanding of African American people and the hate they experience daily, I am able to abandon my so-called heritage without hesitation in order to create a safer and more inviting environment for others.